At Thanksgiving that year, my mother raised her glass in front of nearly 100 people and said, "One daughter is a doctor. The other one, well, she helps around the house." Everyone laughed. No one realized I was the one who paid to rent the hall they were sitting in. The laughter wasn't sharp at first. It was social, soft, obedient, the kind people offer when they're trying to stay welcome. I stood by the coffee urn with a stack of napkins pressed to my stomach, smiling the way you smile when you've learned that any other expression becomes a story someone tells later. The church community hall smelled like turkey, cinnamon, and that lemony floor cleaner volunteers swear by. Folding tables formed a long buffet line. Round tables filled the room like a quilt of families. Relatives, neighbors, people from my mother's Bible study, a few of Olivia's friends from the hospital. A microphone waited near the front beside a fake fall wreath, as if tonight needed an official soundtrack. My mother moved through it all like she'd choreographed it. She touched shoulders, laughed too loudly, accepted compliments with her chin lifted. When she reached Olivia, her whole face changed, softened, glowed, became the version of herself she saved for the child who made her look good. Olivia stood in a fitted sweater and perfect hair, her smile bright and untroubled. People leaned into her without being invited. They always did. Their questions came eager and respectful. "Where do you practice? How long have you been a doctor? Do you do Botox?" And Olivia answered like she was handing out blessings. No one asked me anything. That wasn't new. What was new was the room size. 100 people meant 100 chances to be turned into a punchline. I'd dressed carefully. Dark blouse, plain slacks, nothing that said guest. It wasn't shame, it was strategy. If I looked like the help would ignore me. Guests would ignore me. And I could move the way I needed to move. Quiet, efficient, unseen. A man I didn't recognize approached the coffee station and pointed at the urn. "Is this decaf?" "Left is decaf," I said automatically. Then I caught myself because my mouth had answered before my pride could intervene. He nodded, satisfied. "Thanks. You work here?" The napkins felt suddenly ridiculous. I kept my expression mild. "Something like that." He walked away without another glance, already comfortable with the version of me he'd invented. Across the room, my mother's friends from church were dissecting someone's divorce in low, delighted voices. Near the dessert table, I recognized a woman who wore the kind of jewelry that never catches on a sweater. She laughed at something Olivia said and touched Olivia's arm, as if proximity could rub off success. I drifted toward the buffet to check on things, which was what my mother always said when she wanted me out of the way. As I passed a table, someone snapped their fingers lightly, just once, like a signal. "Miss, could you bring more forks?" I paused. For half a second, I considered correcting them. "My name is Emily. I'm a guest. I'm someone's daughter." I swallowed the thought like a bitter pill and reached for the box of plastic forks under the table. When I stood back up, my father was watching me from across the room. Richard Carter, quiet, careful, permanently braced for conflict. Our eyes met, and his gaze dropped first, like it always did. Not cruelty. Worse. Avoidance. My mother appeared at my shoulder, close enough that I could smell her perfume. "Emily," she said brightly, loud enough for 2 nearby tables to hear. "Can you refill the coffee? People are waiting." Waiting. As if I'd been assigned to the job. As if that was why I existed here. I turned toward the urn, my hands steady, my pulse not. I poured coffee into fresh cups while my mother continued laughing at the center of the room, while Olivia accepted praise like it was her due, while strangers sat in a hall I had quietly paid for, unrecognized, unnamed, perfectly useful. I set down the pot, smoothed my blouse, and looked around the room one more time, letting the truth settle in my chest like a weight I'd decided to carry on purpose. Almost everyone in this room had hired my company, and none of them knew. 4 years before that Thanksgiving, I was fired from my sister's clinic. I had exactly 20 minutes to disappear. The practice manager called me into her office on a Monday morning, the kind of morning that smelled faintly of antiseptic and printer toner. Sandra Collins sat behind her desk with a folder laid squarely in front of her, hands folded like she was about to deliver a prayer instead of a verdict. I remember noticing the clock first, 9:47 a.m., because routine had always been my safety. Schedules, checklists, patient charts. If everything was done right, nothing could go wrong. That had been my theory. "Emily, please sit down." Her voice sounded rehearsed. I lowered myself into the chair and tried to read the room the way I always did with nervous patients. Tight shoulders, avoiding eye contact, the folder placed just so. None of it looked hopeful. "We've received complaints about your performance," she said. The words landed without meaning at first. Complaints didn't make sense. I had perfect attendance. I stayed late. I learned patient histories faster than anyone else at the front desk. I knew who was allergic to latex and who fainted at the sight of needles. I kept the place running. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "What complaints?" Sandra shifted her hands. "I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics." "From who?" Another pause, longer this time. "That's confidential." I felt the ground tilt, not dramatically, just enough to make everything uncertain. "Can I respond to them?" "The decision has already been made." The sentence was clean and final, like a door clicking shut. "I'm afraid we have to let you go, effective immediately." The room went quiet except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. 5 years of arriving early and leaving late dissolved into a single moment that didn't even warrant a conversation. "You'll have 20 minutes to collect your belongings." 20 minutes. I nodded because that seemed like the appropriate response to a timeline that erased half a decade. My desk fit into a cardboard box faster than I expected. A chipped mug, a small plant, a framed photo from a Christmas that looked happier than it felt. Evidence of a life reduced to portable objects. On the way out, I passed Olivia's office. The door stood open. She was leaning back in her chair with the phone tucked against her shoulder, laughing softly at something someone said. Sunlight fell across her desk in warm lines. She didn't turn, not once. 2 weeks later, Rachel called me. Her voice came through the speaker, thin and nervous. "I thought you knew." "Knew what?" A long silence followed. I could almost hear her choosing sides and hating herself for it. "It was Olivia," she said finally. "She told Sandra you were a liability, that patients felt uncomfortable with you, that you weren't professional enough." The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's story. "That's not true." "I know," Rachel said quickly. "Everyone knows." I stared through the windshield at the Walmart parking lot stretching out in front of me. Endless rows of faded lines and parked cars. Sandra hadn't argued with a physician, especially not a partner. My sister had spoken, and the room had gone silent. I sat there for a long time after the call ended, hands resting on the steering wheel, trying to understand how someone who shared my childhood could erase me with a few sentences. I didn't lose my job. I lost my place in the family. I never planned to build a business. I only planned to survive. After the clinic, survival came down to rent and groceries and the quiet panic that settled into my chest every time I checked my bank balance. I had a few $100s, a used car that groaned when it started, and no reference I trusted enough to use. When a friend of a friend mentioned a woman in Paradise Valley who needed help cleaning, I said yes before I even asked how much it paid. Mrs. Whitmore lived in a house that looked more like a hotel than a home. Tall windows, polished stone floors, rooms that echoed when you walked through them. The first morning I arrived, she led me through the kitchen and showed me where she kept the supplies, apologizing as if she were the one imposing. "Just the basics," she said. "Whatever you can manage." I nodded and got to work. Scrubbing counters didn't require confidence. Vacuuming didn't care about resumes. For a few hours at a time, I could disappear into motion and forget the clinic. Forget Sandra's careful voice. Forget Olivia's silence. But after a few visits, I started noticing things that had nothing to do with dust. Stacks of unopened envelopes gathered on the kitchen counter. A calendar hung crooked on the wall, filled with crossed-out appointments. The refrigerator held expired groceries shoved behind newer ones. A loose cabinet hinge clicked every time the door opened. The garage light flickered, half dead and ignored. The house was spotless. Her life wasn't. One afternoon, without being asked, I sorted the envelopes into neat piles by date. Bills in one stack, advertisements in another. I wrote the due dates on sticky notes and lined them up beside the coffee maker where she would see them in the morning. I called the number printed on the cabinet warranty and scheduled a repair. I cleared the refrigerator and left a short grocery list on the counter. When Mrs. Whitmore came home that evening, she stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time without speaking. "You did all this?" I shrugged. It needed doing. Her eyes filled unexpectedly. "No one has ever done that for me." That was the moment something shifted. Cleaning wasn't really what she needed. Clean was easy. Clean was visible. What she needed was someone who noticed what everyone else stepped over. After that, she started asking for small things. Could I wait for a delivery? Could I check if the landscaper showed up? Could I call the electrician she never had time to reach? Each task led to another, and soon I was managing pieces of a life that ran smoother when no one noticed who made it that way. My Aunt Linda listened while I tried to explain it over the phone one night. "You see what other people miss," she said. "That's worth something. Cleaning houses isn't exactly a future. Maybe that's not what you're doing." The idea formed slowly, like something surfacing from deep water. People with big houses had complicated lives. They needed quiet solutions. They needed someone dependable who didn't ask questions. Someone invisible. I filed the paperwork 6 months later. Silverline Services, LLC. The name sounded steadier than I felt. At first, it was just me, moving from one address to another with a notebook full of schedules and errands. Then, Mrs. Whitmore mentioned me to a friend. The friend mentioned me to a property manager. Work multiplied in small, manageable pieces until I hired one employee, then two. I kept everything quiet. No announcements, no explanations. When my mother asked what I did for work, I told her the simplest version. I clean houses. She never asked anything else. By the 3rd year, Silverline handled more homes than I could personally visit. Contracts sat in neat folders in a rented office barely larger than a storage unit. Employees texted me questions I knew how to answer without hesitation. Problems came and went. The system held. Late one evening, I stood alone in that office, reading through payroll reports and service schedules, realizing that the numbers represented dozens of people whose work depended on decisions I made every day. The thought didn't feel triumphant. It felt steady. I had built something real without anyone noticing. My phone buzzed against the desk. A message from my mother. "Don't forget Thanksgiving. Come early and help this year." I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. Of course. They still saw me the same way. Maybe they always would. They thought I cleaned houses. I was building an empire. By the 4th year, Silverline had grown into something that no longer fit inside a notebook. Schedules filled entire spreadsheets. Client requests arrived faster than I could answer them. There were mornings when my phone started vibrating before I even opened my eyes. Drivers asking for gate codes, house managers confirming arrivals, a supervisor checking supply orders. The work had stopped feeling temporary. It had weight now, structure. People depended on it. Most days, I drove a modest car through neighborhoods where the houses rose behind stone walls and private gates. Inside those gates were the kinds of homes people assumed belonged to someone important. I parked in service areas, entered through side doors, and spoke quietly to security guards who recognized me by face but not by name. That was how Silverline worked. Discreet, invisible, reliable. One of Mrs. Whitmore's introductions eventually led to something bigger, a meeting at a luxury resort in Paradise Valley. The general manager wanted a company that could manage overflow housekeeping and private guest requests without mistakes or questions. Reputation mattered more than price. Discretion mattered more than advertising. I signed the contract with steady hands and drove home in silence afterward, letting the reality settle. That single agreement paid more each month than I had earned in a year at the clinic. Half the people who attended my mother's gatherings vacationed at that resort. I knew because I'd seen their names on guest lists and service requests. Wine deliveries, last-minute airport pickups, anniversary decorations arranged before arrival. I handled it all without ever being seen. When my mother asked about work during her occasional phone calls, I gave her the version she expected. "Still cleaning," I said. "That's nice," she replied, with the same careful pause she always used. She never asked for details. None of them did. By late summer, Silverline employed more people than I could keep track of without weekly reports. The office space expanded into 2 adjoining rooms with mismatched furniture and a printer that sounded like it might give up at any moment. It wasn't impressive, but it was mine. The email arrived on a quiet afternoon while I was reviewing invoices. At first, I almost deleted it, assuming it was another vendor promotion. The subject line caught my eye only because it included my name. What to do about Emily. I opened it without thinking. The message had been forwarded months earlier from an address I recognized as my Aunt Laura's. It must have slipped into spam and stayed there unnoticed until the filters reset. The chain stretched back more than a year. Replies stacked on replies between my mother and Olivia, with Laura occasionally answering in shorter lines. I read the first message twice before the words fully registered. "I don't know what to do about Emily at Thanksgiving. It's embarrassing when people ask what she does." Another reply followed. "Just keep her helping in the kitchen. No one needs details." Further down, Olivia wrote, "After this year, she'll understand her place." I scrolled slowly, my hands growing colder with each line. They discussed me like a problem to manage, an inconvenience to arrange around seating charts and introductions. One message from my mother sat in the middle of the chain like a quiet confession. "Sometimes I wish I only had one daughter." The office felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. For a long time, I stared at the screen without moving, letting the meaning settle into something solid and undeniable. When I finally closed the email, I opened a new folder and named it with a single word: evidence. The hall felt warmer than it should have that evening, thick with voices and the dull clatter of plates being cleared. Conversations overlapped in waves, neighbors catching up, church friends exchanging recipes, Olivia answering questions she had answered 100 times before. I stayed near the side of the room where movement looked natural, collecting empty cups and straightening chairs no one had asked me to touch. My mother had been building toward the moment all night. I could see it in the way she hovered near the microphone stand, in the way she glanced around to make sure enough people were watching. When she finally stepped forward and lifted her glass, the room settled into a polite hush. She smiled the way she did in photographs, bright and confident, certain of her audience. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," she began. "It means so much to have friends and family together like this." People nodded. A few murmured agreement. She gestured toward Olivia. "I'm so proud of my daughter. As most of you know, Olivia is a physician now, running a very successful practice. A ripple of approving sounds passed through the tables. Olivia dipped her head modestly, already accustomed to admiration. Then my mother turned slightly, searching until her eyes landed on me. "And of course, there's Emily," she said, her voice shifting into something lighter. "She helps out wherever we need her." A few people chuckled. My mother's smile widened, encouraged by the reaction. "One daughter is a doctor," she said, lifting her glass toward Olivia. Then she tilted it in my direction. "The other one is basically our maid." Laughter spread quickly this time, louder and easier. Chairs creaked. Someone slapped a tabletop. The sound filled the room in a way that left no space for anything else. I stood still long enough for the noise to crest and begin to fall. My pulse felt steady, almost detached, as if I were watching the moment happen to someone else. Then I set the tray down. A few people noticed the movement first. Conversations thinned. My chair legs scraped softly against the floor as I stepped into the open space near the microphone, though I didn't touch it. "You're right," I said. My voice carried farther than I expected. The remaining laughter died in uncertain fragments. "I do clean houses." Silence settled, cautious and incomplete. "Including the resort where half of you stayed last summer." Several heads turned. A man near the center frowned as recognition stirred. Someone whispered a name under their breath. I let the pause stretch just long enough. "My name is Emily Carter." My mother's smile faltered. "I'm the owner." The words hung in the air, simple and unmistakable. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the small background noises, the shifting chairs, the quiet clink of dishes, seemed to disappear. Faces turned toward me with a new kind of attention, measuring and uncertain. Near the second table from the front, a woman leaned forward slowly. "Silverline?" I nodded once. Her eyes widened. "Wait, you're that Emily Carter?" The question seemed to confirm itself as it traveled outward. Expressions changed in small but visible ways. Confusion giving way to realization. Realization to something quieter. My mother stood frozen beside the microphone, her glass still raised halfway. Olivia's face had lost its color. My father stared down at the tablecloth as if the pattern might offer an escape. No one laughed now. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair and slipped it over my shoulders. The room parted easily as I walked toward the exit, the same way crowds make space for something fragile passing through. The door closed behind me with a soft, ordinary sound that felt louder than any applause. The night air was cool and clean after the heat inside. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me before walking to my car. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt finished with hiding. The ballroom lights were softer than the ones in the church hall, but they reached farther. They washed across rows of round tables and polished glassware, over dark suits and evening dresses, settling into corners where quiet conversations waited for the program to begin. The air smelled faintly of perfume and catered food, carefully neutral, designed not to offend anyone important. I arrived through the side entrance and paused just inside the corridor, letting the calm of the place settle into me. There was no rush here, no scrambling to refill cups or straighten chairs. Tonight, I wasn't moving around the edges. Tonight, I had a place in the center, whether I wanted it or not. From behind the curtain, I could see most of the room. Table cards marked the seating in neat rows. Business owners, local officials, people who spoke in measured voices and shook hands with practiced confidence. Toward the middle, at a table close enough to see clearly, but not close enough to belong, sat my parents. My mother wore a deep burgundy dress, her posture rigid with anticipation. She studied the program as if it might reveal the evening's purpose if she read it carefully enough. My father sat beside her, hands folded, his gaze drifting across the room with quiet uncertainty. Olivia leaned toward her husband, speaking in low tones that never quite reached a smile. They had come because it looked important, because someone they knew had passed along an invitation, because events like this mattered in the right circles. None of them knew why I had insisted they attend. The ceremony moved forward with predictable rhythm. Introductions, acknowledgments, applause offered on cue. Names came and went. Awards were announced. I listened without hearing, my attention fixed on the steady rise and fall of anticipation inside my chest. When the presenter stepped back to the microphone near the end of the program, the room settled again. This year's award recognizes an entrepreneur who built something remarkable from the ground up, he said. A company defined by discretion, reliability, and growth. I felt the familiar stillness return, the same calm that had carried me through other moments when there was no way back. Please welcome Emily Carter. My mother's head lifted sharply. Even from a distance, I could see the confusion forming before recognition caught up. Chairs shifted as people turned toward the stage. I walked out into the light. For a moment, the brightness made the room indistinct, faces blending into shapes, movement into color. Then my vision steadied and I saw them clearly. My mother frozen mid-breath. My father leaning forward as if proximity might change what he was seeing. Olivia sitting very still. The microphone stood at the center of the stage. I adjusted it slightly, more for the comfort of the gesture than the need. I started my company because I had to, I said. There was a time when cleaning houses was the only work I could find. The room listened in attentive silence. I learned quickly that people don't just need clean spaces. They need someone who notices the things no one else sees, someone who solves problems quietly. A few heads nodded. Recognition passed through the audience in subtle ways, the understanding of effort, of persistence. There were people who thought that work was something to be ashamed of, people who believed success only looked one way. I let the words settle before continuing. Some people called me an embarrassment. The phrase hung in the air without accusation. They just didn't recognize success. Applause began in scattered bursts before gathering strength. The sound rose into something steady and sustained, filling the ballroom with a warmth that felt different from laughter, earned instead of borrowed. When I stepped down from the stage, people approached with handshakes and brief congratulations. I answered politely, letting the moment pass without trying to hold it. Eventually, the crowd thinned enough for a familiar figure to reach me. My mother stopped a few steps away, as if uncertain where she was allowed to stand. Emily, she said quietly, why didn't you tell us? Her voice carried something unfamiliar, hesitation where certainty usually lived. I looked at her for a long moment, noticing details I might once have missed. The careful makeup, the tension around her eyes, the effort it took for her to remain composed. You never asked. The words came gently, without anger. She opened her mouth as if to answer, then closed it again. Behind her, my father waited in silent understanding. Olivia stood farther back, unreadable. I gathered my coat and turned toward the exit, leaving the lights and voices behind. Outside, the evening air felt cool and steady against my skin. For years, I had waited for them to see me. Now they had, and for the first time, it no longer felt necessary.